Welcome back, everyone. We've got another deep dive curated just for you. This time, we're going to be looking into the assassination of Alberta King.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people know the tragic story of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, but his mother also met a tragic and really, I'd say, an even more baffling end.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to hear what you think makes this case so unique and so compelling.
Well, I think it's the assassin himself, Marcus Wayne Chenault. I mean, he went from being this good boy, like
Yeah.
described as a really good boy by his family, and then turned around and committed this horrific act. It's such a stark contrast.
That's really what drew me to this topic, because when you look at the sources, like all of the descriptions of Chenault before this incident paint this picture of a quiet, studious young man.
Mhm.
So what could have possibly led him to assassinate Alberta King?
Well, one of the big things that people point to is this guy, Hanani Israel. He was the self-proclaimed spiritual leader.
Yeah.
Chenault met him in college, and Israel preached this very unique and some would say pretty controversial form of Black Hebrew Israelite ideology.
Okay, so we need to kind of unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
What do Black Hebrew Israelites believe? I've heard the term before, but to be honest, I'm not really sure I fully understand it.
Sure. I mean, it's a really complex movement, and there's a lot of different branches. But I think generally they believe that Black people are the true descendants of the ancient Israelites.
Ah, okay.
And they often reject mainstream Christianity and Judaism.
Oh, okay.
And they have their own sort of unique interpretation of the Bible.
So how does that connect to Chenault assassinating Alberta King?
Well, this is where it gets really, really fascinating and honestly kind of disturbing.
Yeah.
Israel really specifically targeted Black civil rights leaders
Really?
in his teachings, yeah. And he saw figures like Martin Luther King Jr. as obstacles to Black empowerment. And he even labeled them as evil and deceptive.
Wow. So basically, in Israel's worldview, someone like Martin Luther King Jr. is actually the enemy. I mean, that seems so completely at odds with everything we know about King and his work.
It really is. And I think it's a really key example of how extremist ideologies can just twist and distort concepts for their own purposes.
That begs the question. I mean, did Chenault leave behind any writings or any statements that indicate which of Israel's specific teachings he latched onto? Or was there anything that directly connected those teachings to his actions?
Unfortunately, Chenault remained largely silent about his motivations, especially in the years following the assassination. He actually died in prison in '95, so he kind of took his secrets with him.
That's heartbreaking. It would be so helpful to understand kind of the inner workings of his mind. So did anyone who knew him before this transformation, this radical transformation, did anyone kind of see it coming?
Well, according to the sources, there were some warning signs.
Yeah.
Chenault dropped out of college. He became more and more confrontational. Even adopted this persona of General Chenault and had a run-in with the police for disorderly conduct.
So this radical shift in thinking combined with these troubling behavioral changes, I mean, it paints a pretty clear picture of someone descending into extremism.
Yes. And tragically, it culminated in the assassination of Alberta King.
But before we get into the details of that, I kind of want to shift gears for a moment and talk about Alberta King herself.
Mm.
What kind of woman was she? I know the sources describe her as a real pillar of her community, a powerful force in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, she really was a remarkable woman.
Yeah.
Born in 1903, grew up in Atlanta,
Mm.
daughter of a reverend, and then went on to marry Martin Luther King's secretary, who was also a reverend.
Okay.
And they kind of became these central figures at Ebenezer Baptist Church.
So she was really carrying on this family legacy of faith and leadership, but it wasn't just about religion for her, was it?
No, not at all. She was also deeply involved in social justice work just like her husband and her son, of course. I mean, remember, this was a time of immense struggle for Black Americans. And she was right there on the front lines,
Yeah.
really fighting for equality.
Which, I mean, it just makes the circumstances of her death all the more tragic. I mean, she was assassinated right there in Ebenezer Baptist Church, the same church where her son was buried.
Chilling irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really underscores that kind of cyclical nature of violence and tragedy, especially for Black Americans during this era.
Yeah. I can't help but think about the emotional toll this must have taken on the King family. I mean, they had already lost so much. Did any of the sources touch on how the family reacted to this second devastating loss?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the outpouring of grief and the tributes after her death was just, it was immense. People really remembered her as this woman of deep faith, unwavering strength, and just boundless compassion. And her daughter, Christine King Ferris, described her as the anchor of our family.
It's clear she was an extraordinary woman.
Yeah.
And yet, her life was cut short by this senseless act of violence. It must have been truly devastating
Mm.
for her family and for her community. So can you walk us through that tragic day, June 30th, 1974? What exactly happened?
Well, Chenault traveled from Ohio to Atlanta,
Wow.
and he had a stolen gun with him. Went to Ebenezer Baptist Church, sat through the entire service. And then, as the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, he stood up, shouted, "I'm taking over here this morning," and opened fire.
Oh my goodness. Imagine being in that church in that moment. The
Uh,
peace of prayer just shattered by such a violent outburst.
I know.
It must have been terrifying.
It was. It was a scene of utter chaos and horror. Alberta King was shot and killed instantly, along with the deacon, Edward Boykin.
Whoa, wow.
And then another parishioner, Jimmy Mitchell, was wounded and later died from her injuries.
And to make this tragedy even more heart-wrenching, Alberta King's grandson, Derek King, was there
You know.
and actually helped subdue Chenault.
Yeah.
I can't imagine being a young boy and witnessing such a horrific act of violence and then having the courage to step in and help.
Well, it's a testament to the King family's incredible resilience.
Yeah.
But it's also a reminder, a deeply unsettling reminder of the trauma that violence inflicts even on the youngest witnesses.
It's hard to even begin to process all of that.
Right.
But let's shift our focus to the immediate aftermath of the shooting.
Okay.
What happened next?
Well, Chenault was, apprehended right there at the scene.
Okay.
The trial quickly became a national sensation,
I can only imagine.
and he was initially sentenced to death.
I can only imagine the media frenzy surrounding this case.
Yeah.
A man assassinates the mother of Martin Luther King Jr. It's a story that would grip the nation. But I'm curious about something. Given the King family's stance against capital punishment, how did they react to the death sentence?
Well, they were staunch advocates against the death penalty. And, true to their beliefs, they actually intervened. And ultimately, Chenault's sentence was reduced to life in prison.
Wow, that must have been an incredibly difficult decision for them, given the circumstances.
It was.
Yeah.
But it really speaks volumes about their unwavering commitment to peace and forgiveness, even in the face of unimaginable loss.
It's truly remarkable, the King family's capacity for grace in the face of hatred.
Yeah.
It really is. So if they weren't seeking the death penalty, what was their goal? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, their primary concern was understanding why.
Okay.
Why did this happen?
Okay.
They wanted answers.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to know what drove Chenault to commit such a heinous act.
But as you mentioned earlier, Chenault never really explained his motives, right?
That's right. So their quest for answers remained, largely unfulfilled.
It's a tragic reminder that some questions may never have satisfying answers.
Yeah,
The pain and loss they endured are immeasurable.
it is. But amidst the grief, there was this, there was also a determination to understand, to prevent something like this from happening again. And, that brings us to another layer of this complex story, the conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories, I have to admit that piques my curiosity. What kind of theories were circulating?
Well, given the history of violence and covert operations surrounding the entire civil rights movement, it's not really surprising that some people kind of suspected that there might be something more sinister at play here.
Yeah.
And in fact, prominent figures like Jesse Jackson and Dick Gregory, they publicly questioned the official narrative.
Oh, wow. What were their specific concerns? Did they think Chenault was part of a larger plot, or that he was being manipulated by someone else?
I think their doubts centered on a few key points. One of them was just that the seeming randomness of the attack.
Okay.
Chenault traveled all the way from Ohio and targeted Alberta King in her own church. And so they wondered, was he really acting alone, or did someone put him up to this?
Their skepticism is understandable, especially given the context of the time. Did they have any evidence to support these claims?
Well, there was never any concrete evidence to support a conspiracy. But I think it's important to acknowledge that for many Black Americans, these theories, they really resonated with this deep-seated fear, a fear rooted in the very real history of targeted violence and systemic oppression.
Yeah, this idea that even in sacred spaces like a church, they might not be safe.
Exactly. And so I think these conspiracy theories, while ultimately unsubstantiated, they really highlight the deep mistrust and trauma that so many Black Americans still carry with them.
It's a stark reminder that even though we've made progress as a society, we still have a long way to go when it comes to, addressing these issues of racial injustice and systemic inequity. But for now, let's circle back to Chenault and his trial. You mentioned earlier that his defense team argued that he was insane at the time of the crime. How did that play out in court?
Well, the insanity defense is always a really complex and controversial issue.
Yeah.
But in Chenault's case, psychiatrists testified that he suffered from schizophrenia
Okay.
and delusions of grandeur. And they said this was fueled by his adherence to Israel's extremist teachings. But of course, the prosecution countered that he could still distinguish between right and wrong, which is a crucial element when you're trying to determine legal responsibility.
So even though there was evidence of mental illness, the court ultimately found him culpable for his actions.
Yes. The jury actually rejected the insanity plea, and he was convicted of murder.
Okay.
However, the fact that the King family opposed the death penalty really raised this important question.
Yeah.
What was their reasoning behind that? Yeah.
I mean, I have to imagine that seeing the man who murdered their mother and grandmother, escape the death penalty must have been just incredibly difficult.
It was. But I think their decision really reflects this core principle of their faith and their activism.
Okay.
Which is a belief in the sanctity of all human life.
Wow.
Even the life of someone who committed such a horrific act.
Their commitment to nonviolence and forgiveness is really inspiring. It makes you wonder if they ever tried to engage with Chenault directly, to try to understand his motivations or to maybe even offer him some form of redemption.
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And, while it's impossible to know for sure, it is worth noting that the King family frequently visited prisons and ministered to inmates. So it's conceivable that they may have, reached out to Chenault at some point, but there's no public record of such an interaction.
Yeah, I guess some things will just always remain a mystery. But let's shift our focus for a moment to Chenault's family. How did they cope with the devastating actions of their son and brother?
Well, their reaction was really a mix of shock and disbelief and just heartbreak.
Yeah.
They described him as a good boy, quiet, studious, devoted to his family, and they just couldn't reconcile the young man that they knew with the person who committed this horrific crime.
Yeah. I can only imagine the weight of that guilt and confusion that they must have carried. I mean, it's a reminder that every tragedy has this ripple effect, touching the lives of so many people beyond just the immediate victims.
You're right. And in this case, the ripples extended far beyond just Chenault's immediate family. I mean, the entire nation was grappling with this question of how something like this could happen.
Yeah.
How could a seemingly ordinary young man become so radicalized?
And that brings us back to Hananiah Israel and his teachings. What happened to him after the assassination? Did he face any consequences for his role in influencing Chenault?
Well, while there was widespread condemnation of his extremist views, Israel was never directly charged in connection with the assassination. There simply wasn't enough evidence to prove that he had explicitly incited violence.
It seems like such a gray area legally and morally. I mean, he may not have explicitly called for violence, but his rhetoric certainly created this climate of hate and division that contributed to this tragedy.
Absolutely. And I think this case really highlights that complex challenge of addressing extremist ideologies and hate speech, especially when those ideologies operate within the boundaries of religious freedom. It really raises questions about where we draw the line between protected speech and dangerous incitement.
It's a debate that continues to this day. But let's bring our focus back to Alberta King and her legacy. I mean, she dedicated her life to fighting for social justice and equality. How was she remembered by those who knew and loved her?
She was remembered as a woman of deep faith, unwavering strength, and just boundless compassion. Her daughter, Christine King Ferris, she described her as the anchor of our family, and her impact extended far beyond just her immediate circle.
She sounds like an incredible woman.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking to think that her life was cut short by such a senseless act of violence. But I'm curious, did her assassination have any lasting impact on the civil rights movement? Did it galvanize people to action or lead to any significant policy changes?
That's an interesting question. While her assassination was, of course, a profound tragedy, it didn't spark the same kind of widespread outrage and calls for action that followed, her son's death. And I think perhaps because by 1974, the civil rights movement had already achieved a lot of its legislative goals.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if people had become somewhat desensitized to violence against black leaders, especially after the assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. It's a sobering thought.
It is. But despite the lack of this, massive public outcry, Alberta King's death really served as this poignant reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and that enduring power of hate and intolerance.
It's a reminder that we can never be complacent in the fight against injustice, and it's a reminder that individuals like Alberta King, who dedicate their lives to building a better world, they deserve to be remembered and honored.
You're right. And their stories can inspire us to continue the work that they began, to strive for a world where tragedies like this no longer occur.
Speaking of which, did the sources offer any insights into how the King family coped with this second unimaginable loss? How did they find the strength to keep going in the face of such profound sorrow?
I think the King family's response to tragedy has always been rooted in their deep faith.
Yeah.
And this unwavering commitment to nonviolence, they really channeled their grief into continuing the work that that both Martin Luther King Jr. and Alberta Williams King had dedicated their lives to.
Their ability to transform pain into purpose is truly remarkable. It makes you wonder, though, did any of the sources kind of delve into how this specific tragedy, the loss of their matriarch, how that impacted, the family dynamics?
Well, there's this really poignant quote from Coretta Scott King's memoir.
Okay.
That kind of offers a little insight.
Yeah.
She wrote about how Alberta's death has created this void in their lives that can never be filled, but it also kind of strengthened their resolve to continue fighting for justice and equality.
It's a testament to the enduring power of love and family. Even in the face of such profound loss, they found a way to draw strength from each other and from their shared commitment to a better world. But I have to ask, what about Chenault? Did he ever express any remorse for his actions? Did he ever offer any kind of explanation for why he chose Alberta King as his target?
That's the question that has haunted a lot of people,
Yeah.
Chenault remained largely silent about his motives, especially in the years following the assassination. And he actually died in prison in 1995 from a stroke at the age of 44.
Yeah.
And, he took his secrets with him.
It's almost as if the silence itself kind of speaks volumes, It's a chilling reminder of all those unanswered questions, the complexities of human behavior that we may never fully comprehend.
You're right. And it brings us to this larger question, one that I think is particularly relevant for you. I mean, could something like this happen again? Are there echoes of these extremist ideologies in today's world?
It's a chilling thought, but unfortunately one that feels all too relevant, I mean, we live in a world where extremism and hate speech are just amplified online, where conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. It's not hard to imagine someone, falling down a similar rabbit hole as Chenault, driven by twisted ideologies and fueled by anger and resentment.
Exactly. And while the specific circumstances of Chenault's case might seem like a relic of the past, the underlying forces that really shaped his actions, social isolation, exposure to these radical ideologies, a sense of grievance. I mean, these are all present today, perhaps even more so in our hyper-connected world.
So what does this all mean? I mean, how can we guard against these forces? How do we prevent history from repeating itself?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it starts with education, with really understanding the root causes of extremism. And developing critical thinking skills to challenge these dangerous narratives.
Yeah.
It also means, fostering empathy and understanding, building bridges across communities rather than walls of division.
That makes a lot of sense. We need to equip ourselves and future generations with the tools to recognize and reject these harmful ideologies. But what about on a more personal level? What can individuals do to make a difference?
Well, I think it's about being mindful of our own biases, challenging prejudice wherever we see it, and actively engaging in constructive dialogue with people who hold different viewpoints. It's
Mhm.
about creating this culture of respect and understanding, even when we disagree.
That's a tall order for sure, but
Yeah.
it feels essential.
Yeah.
We can't let fear and hatred win. We have to keep fighting for a world where tragedies like the assassination of Alberta King, never
Yeah.
happen again.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the King family's legacy offers this really powerful roadmap for this fight.
Yeah.
Their unwavering commitment to peace, to justice, to forgiveness, even in the face of immense suffering. It's an inspiration to us all.
Absolutely. Their story really reminds us that even amidst the